Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now it has been literally years since the last time I painted an Ultramarine for the channel, and since then, to be honest, my technique has changed a little and there have been some new developments, new releases, paints and stuff like that which make the job easier. So a question that has come up a couple of times is, would I change how I paint them? And the short answer is yes. So I thought, with the fact that I've now got some better recording equipment as well, it might be worth coming back and revisiting the classics. So here we have it, an Ultramarine Sergeant, from start to finish. I'm going to show you every step along the way, including the basing, and I promise it is way easier than it looks. Now this is here for the folks who want to highlight a miniature without having to fuss too much. And I think there are a couple of tricks along the way which you'll find useful, no matter what it is you're painting. So this method will use a few more paints than usual. Ordinarily, I like to keep things fairly trim in that respect, but today we are going to use quite a few, so be aware of that. All of them will be listed in the description below though, so you can follow along. Let's get started. So the very first thing we need to address is the case of the headless Space Marine. Now generally when you're painting a sergeant or anybody else who has a bare head, you're going to find it easier to spray and paint that head separately. Now I've sprayed this fellow with Wraithbone because we are going to paint him in a very particular way, but even if you sprayed him blue and you were to paint him using Bugman's Glow, Reichland Flesh Shade and so forth, you'll find it easier to reach all of the details on the face without having to worry about hitting this little gorget at the front here. We can then pluck this off later and glue it into place with a little dab of super glue. What this means for our power armor is we can paint all of this without having to worry about hitting the face, which is brilliant. It's going to save us a lot of time overall. Also good to do if you're painting helmets that are going to be a very different color. So with Ultramarines, if you're painting white helmets, spray them separately, spray them white. Now I've primed this Ultramarine with a spray of Macragge blue, but the first step we're going to take is actually to paint some Macragge blue over the top of that. The reason for this is twofold. First of all, any areas that you miss with the primer, you'll be able to fill those in now. And on top of that, if we need to come back later and fix up any areas of detail, you'll find that paint from the pot will have a slightly different texture to the primer. So anywhere that we fix up later, it will stand out if we don't put down this little layer first. Now it doesn't need to be particularly precise. I've got just a wee bit of water in here, and any brush which has a wedge tip is going to be really useful for this. Now it's a little difficult to see on camera, but that texture is now slightly smoother and we have a much more solid blue. You'll notice as well it's just a little bit brighter than Macragge blue straight from the can, so good practice to make sure that you're still putting at least a coat of your base color over your primer. Anyhow, let's put him down for a second because we're going to move on to a dry brush. So I'm going to start off by grabbing some Ethereum blue and jab some of this onto the end of a brush. Now you can use a small dry brush. I'm going to use, though, makeup brushes. These are really useful because they've got nice soft bristles, and that's actually going to be really handy for what we're doing. So I've got way too much paint on my brush there because, goodness me, if I try applying that, that's going to go terribly wrong. So I'm going to work most of this off into a bit of paper towel. And then when I've got about as much as I think is going to work out of there, I've got this piece of cardboard here which has been primed black a few times, and you can see I've made a fair bit of use of it. What I'm going to do is lightly run my brush a few times across that surface, and you'll see over time I build up the color rather than leaving big streaky smears behind, and that's ideal. That's what I want for a dry brush. So just to play it safe, I'm going to dry brush lightly along the edge of his base there to get an idea of what I'm going to leave behind, and that's looking about right. It might be a little bit much, but we'll touch on that in a second. I'm going to drag across any areas of detail where I want a nice sharp edge. So very lightly flicking a few times around the edge of his gorget here, and we get this really sharp highlight. Now that's Ethereum blue is extremely bright by comparison, but we are going to bring that down a little bit later. So I'm going to do the same across all of the armor, trying to concentrate on any edges where I want that nice light blue. But you're going to find, funnily enough, in some areas you will get a slightly chalky finish, especially on rounded areas like down on his feet and what have you. But don't worry, make sure that you're hitting the sharp edges first and we'll come back to fix up those other little bits later. You'll end up with a very sharp highlight on all the edges of detail where you want it, but like I mentioned, some chalky areas, especially on flat panels on his legs. But that's okay. I've got my medium layer brush, and I'm going to go back to some McCrag blue, same as I mentioned earlier. What I'm going to do is just fill in some of the areas close to these edges that I want to remain the lighter blue, but I can use, this is much easier than trying to paint a straight line, when you're just getting started. So I can leave that little bit of highlighting there where I want it. Another good example on this is going to be his backpack. This big dome shape in the center, I'm just going to put a little bit of thinned out McCrag blue and tidy that up. So any areas like his legs, again, really good example. Let's just straighten that up. What you can do now is tidy up the blue so that it looks a little sharper and not quite so chalky. And with that little bit of tidy up work, you'll see that there's a really easy way to get that nice sharp highlight, especially if you haven't got the steadiest hands in the world. We need to put this fella aside again though, because we're going to mix up our shade. I've got my large shade brush, and I'm going to dip this a few times into some Lamy and medium, and then put 1, 2, 3, and why not? Let's go for 4 drops of this, which is super difficult to see on your palette. Then we're going to add the same of Drakenhof Nightshade. Now it's important that you shake the dickens out of this before you use it. So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm actually going to add a 5th. Ordinarily I'd suggest you can go straight half and half of medium and shade, but I tend to find I like mine a little bit darker. Now you could use pure Drakenhof Nightshade here, you're just going to get a darker effect. So we grab our Space Marine and our Lamy and medium Drakenhof Nightshade mix, and we're going to apply this over all of the armor. So you can apply this fairly quickly. You do want to make sure that it is getting into all of your recesses, because this is going to darken down the highlight that we've done and serve as our shade for the armor. So obviously, this is way too much. You see this big pool at the back here. Let's move that away with my brush and put that somewhere a little more useful. So this takes a bit of practice, but you'll find it is nice and quick. So I'm going to apply this over the entire model, as I mentioned, and then we'll let this dry for about half an hour. And once it's had time to dry, this is what you'll have. And I really like that depth of color. We've still got our highlight intact, the shading is there too, and that blue hasn't been dulled down too much. I really like how that turns out. I think the pack is a great place to see how that works. But Ultramarines like to be difficult, and their sergeants have red helmets. So I have here a little Mephiston red, and we're going to apply this just straight over all of the helmet. Now this, you'll probably find you need to do 2, maybe even 3 coats. Going over a very dark primer, well not primer, but base color like this, you want to make sure it's a nice solid color. So let's go ahead and apply a couple of coats of Mephiston red. Now I did end up doing 3 coats to make sure that I got a nice bright red here. We're going to move on to a highlight, and we are going to edge highlight this. I have Fire Dragon Bright, and same as with our blue earlier, this is going to look absolutely obscene going on, but trust me. Now same as with our dry brush, any mistakes you make, like oh dear I've put too much on there, we can tidy up in the same way by going back with a little of our base color later. So I'm going to apply this fairly haphazardly. I'm not terribly worried if I make any mistakes. And in a couple of seconds I'll come back with that red and fix these up. Oh gosh, that wasn't an intentional splodge. Now after a little tidy up with our Mephiston red again, that's looking much more reasonable. What I've got is a little bit of Carroburg Crimson, and I'm not going to water this down, but I'm not going to apply very much. Just using our medium layer brush, we're going to paint this over the whole helmet. Now when that shade dries, it brings in that really sharp orange and gives us plenty of shading. It's really nice, very simple. Now these next few stages, what I'm going to do is skip over them fairly quickly because all we're going to do is apply some base coats. So first off, I'm actually using here a Vallejo color. This is black gray. Now if you want to stick purely to Citadel products, then Eschen Grey would be your closest here. I'm using this because the coverage is much better, but you can stick to Citadel if that's what you've got access to. So what I'm going to do is apply this to all of the rubberized suit elements. Take my time when I come near any of the armor. And if you're worried about spilling onto the blue while you're painting, just don't paint that area. All right, it's going to be more noticeable if you make a big gray blotch than it will be if, oh well, one part of the suit just isn't painted. Now with that drying, I'm going to move on to the black areas. And for this, for the same reason of coverage, I'm using Vallejo's black. Now, you can use a Baden black here if you fancy. Whatever you've got access to. It is more important that it's easy for you to find. But if you can find it, I do recommend flat black is the better option here. So, as weapon, casing, and as equipment. Now this next step is one of the time-consuming ones. For this, I'm going to use Iron Hand steel. Now there's no reason you couldn't use lead belcher if that's what you've got. I just prefer a slightly lighter metallic color because when we shade it, then we're not going to have to highlight it afterwards. I'm going to use my medium, base brush, and we're going to paint over the easier to reach areas with this. And then when I get down close to areas, like on his plasma pistol here, I'm going to swap to a small layer brush and tidy those up a little. Now, particularly on flat areas like his hammer, you're probably going to need to give that a second coat, but for the most part, that is done. We'll move on now to another slow, time-consuming step, and that's going to be with Retributor armor, we will base coat the gold. Now, same deal here, you're probably going to find that you're going to need to apply a second coat, but let me show you something when it comes to shoulder pads. Now, rather than trying to paint a straight line by dragging my brush downward, I'm going to align my brush carefully sideways so that I can instead, let's flip him around the other way actually so I don't hit his elbow, I am going to, there we go, just drag my brush along its edge along the flat part of the shoulder pad. Now some areas you're not going to be able to do that, but for the most part you'll find that a really easy way of getting the base coats down on the majority of that gold. Now, if you don't have the steadiest hands, this step will take a while. But, for example, up on his shoulder pad here, I invite you to see where I made the mistake. If you do splash over any gold, just a little bit of McCrag blue, you can tidy it up, same as everything else we've done. It's just paint. Now, for any dangly parchments or what have you, so you've got purity seals, or this ultramarine thing this fella's wearing, I have Rakarth flesh. And same as with most of these lighter colors, over that dark blue, we're probably going to need to give this 2 coats. Now we'll use a little screamer pink for the haft of his axe. And if he had any wax purity seals, I'd also use this for the wax. This works really well for that. Now to finish off the base coats, I'm going to use a little bit of Avalanche Sunset to paint in the cable here on his hammer. And I'm also going to use this to dot in a couple of the little lamps on his wristband doofer up there. And I'll probably use just a touch of green on it as well. But that one, yeah, we'll see. Once this is finished, that's all of the base coats applied. You can cruise back and do any cleanup last minute that you need to do. And once you've got any cleanup out of the way, we'll start applying some shades. I'm going to start off with Nuln Oil, and we're going to apply this over the metalwork and any of the rubberized areas in his suit. Now for any bits like the haft of his hammer, or purity seals and similar, I have a little bit of Agrax Earthshade. Now you can also paint the gold in Agrax Earthshade if you like, but it will give you a very dark finish, and depending on the look you're going for, that can actually look really cool. Like I'd suggest, find yourself a spare Space Marine sometime and see how you like the look, but personally I am going to use something different. And rather than keep you in suspense, it is Reichland Flesh Shade. Now I'm going to use a small layer brush to apply this because I want a fair amount of control, and that will actually be too much. So I'm going to work that off and just drag some of that out of the recesses there. This will give you a really nice rose gold kind of appearance. A little less beaten and worn than Agrax Earthshade would. So for Space Marines, I tend to think if you want them to look tidy, this is a good choice. Now once those last couple of shades are dry, there's no reason you couldn't call them done. But I'm going to show you a couple of highlights because I think, it's worth seeing. But on top of that, we're also going to do something to his plasma pistol here. So I've got a little bit of white scar, and I'm going to paint this into the little plasma coils there. I'm doing this now because, as with everything, if I make a mistake, doesn't matter. I haven't highlighted the black, so I can just cover over those areas if I need to. And I'm very definitely going to need to. What did I tell you? White paint absolutely everywhere. So that's why we're doing this now. So I have now Aethermatic Blue, and I'm going to stick to my layer brush for this. We're just going to paint this straight over the top of the white we've laid down as its base coat. And just like that, plasma. Now you can use any contrast color you like here. I tend to think that this looks the best though. Matter of personal taste, adjust as necessary. Now once that Aethermatic Blue has dried, you can tidy up with your black again. And just like that, plasma. Done! Now we'll move on to a couple of the highlights. I'm using Ushabti Bone here, and I'm going to touch up just a little bit of the paper dangling from these purity seals. Now for the black on his pistol as well as equipment, you can use a little Dawnstone. And same as we did for his shoulder pads, instead of using the tip of your brush, you can use the edge here, and you'll find it a little easier to get a straight line. And now finally, I've got a little bit of Liberator Gold. And when it comes to painting the chest eagle, what we'll do is just bop the top of the skull in the center here with a little of this. And then rather than trying to individually paint wingtips, just flick your brush lightly down the outer edge of the wings, and that'll work just fine as a nice simple highlight. You can take your time and instead, elect to paint those tips individually, but they will take a lot longer, and the chances of things going a bit sideways are increased. Now with that little bit of highlighting, the gold really pops. The other thing I've done is to come back with a little bit of Avalanche Sunset just to touch up the hammer cable there and start painting in the rock. But I realized there was one detail I'd actually forgotten, and that is his armor. If you really want to go above and beyond, if there's any bits that the dry brush might have missed, or you feel like you want to tidy up and call attention to, grab yourself some Fenrisian Grey, and a nice sharp point on your brush is going to be extremely important here. All we'll do is just pick out some of the areas where, say on his knee pad here, for example, this is a really good spot for this. You can highlight towards the center so that you get an extra sharp highlight there. Now you can do as much of this as you like on the armor or as little, but I figured it's worth pointing out how to do it because it looks kind of cool. In areas like on his chest, for example, where it's difficult to reach with the dry brush, you can get in there with the brush now. Now there are going to be a couple of areas where that highlight stands out quite a bit, like particularly on the chest area, as I mentioned. But if I spin them around, I think you can see some areas where I've highlighted, but some of them are not so obvious. And in fact, some of the areas that I haven't highlighted don't look so out of place. So that's a really cool way if you have to tidy up any of your highlights, sharpen them up, or add a little bit of extra detail that your dry brush might have missed. Job's a good one. So what I'm going to do with this fella now is take him outside and hit him with a spray of Munitorum Varnish. It's a slight satin finish, which I think works really well for Space Marines. So I'm going to spray that and put him aside, and we'll get started on the face. Now, I've only just now remembered, before I varnished him, I should have applied his decals. If you apply the decals before you varnish them, you'll be able to keep them protected. So, whoops, but not to worry. I've cut out a few decals here that I'm going to apply. And as you can see, because he's a sergeant, he gets to wear the little red skull over his Ultramarines badge. So once those are settled on your kitchen towel, this is the best place to just start splashing a bunch of water on them. It'll keep them wet, and it gives you more time to work with the ones that you're not currently, tweezing off and applying to the miniature. So I'm going to keep soaking these for about 30 seconds, up to a minute. And once you get a little bit of motion on the paper, just add a wee bit of water where you're going to put the transfer and slide it off with a brush onto your miniature. Now you'll notice in particular with these larger decals, applying them on a rounded surface can be a little bit of a challenge, but just get it as close to center as you can and gently dab it down with a Q-tip or a bit of kitchen towel, very carefully to get some of the water out from underneath it. Now, decals will shrink a little as they dry, so they'll tighten on that surface, but we're going to do one more thing to them to make sure that they're nice and smooth on our painted marine. Now, once your decals have had a little bit of time to settle, we're going to turn to this Vallejo decal medium. Now, I've in the past used Micro Set and Micro Sol. Today, I can't find where I've put them, so I'm turning to what I've got. So we'll pop out just a couple of drops of this onto my palette, and then fairly similarly to a paint, we're just going to apply a couple of layers of this over the decals. And you'll notice straight away that they start to soften and bend to the shape of the pad. That one isn't quite stuck down yet. Now I've rolled some decal medium into this Q-tip or baby bud, whatever it is you call it where you are, and I'm going to use this to gently press down and sort of roll out in some areas where I get any wrinkles. Now this will take a little bit of practice. You do normally need to apply a couple of coats of this stuff and leave it a minute or so before working with it. As well, be gentle with the transfers. It's genuinely softening the paper that they're on, and you can very easily tear them if you're not careful. Now that I've sort of dulled down the finish on the shoulder pads, what I've got is a little bit of Storm Shield, the varnish from the pot. Thin that down with just a bit of water, and I'm going to apply this over my decals now. And then we can finally call the Armour state of things finished. Now decals to me, they finish a miniature. You know, no matter how simple the paint job is, those little extra bits of detail really help sell it. So that's now ready to put aside. And now we can paint the face, which is not going to show up properly on camera because, okay. Now once upon a time, painting faces was difficult, and then they went ahead and they released contrast. And I don't use it for a lot of things, but the stuff that it's good at, oh my goodness. So I have here Guilliman flesh, no great surprise, and an ordinary medium layer brush, and we're just going to apply a coat of this straight over the skin. Now once that contrast is settled and dried, I cannot get over how easy it is to do these things, eh? You could go ahead and just pop them on like that, you know, call the face painted, but we'll take it a little further. We've still got our Reikland flesh shade from earlier, so I'm going to apply a layer of this all over the skin. Now from here, you could just dry brush it with a little bit of Eldar flesh if you wanted a really quick finish, but I've got some Kislev flesh on the end of a small layer brush, and we're going to pick out areas like the tip of his nose, along his cheekbones is always a good candidate, areas like his chin. We'll come back and have a look at this in a second, because it's quite difficult to do that while I'm concentrating what is the camera seeing. Now that really is just a few quick lines, and you'll tend to find that between the contrast and the shade, it'll really give you some clues on where you want to highlight. We'll do his hair. For this fella I'm going to use a Garros Dunes. This is a good sort of just off blonde colour. So spin him around, and from this side, just quickly sweep this over the top of his head. Now do you still have your shafty bone from earlier? If you do, just pop some of that onto a nice thin brush, and I'll make sure I've not got very much on there at all. All I'm going to do is just a few little flicky flicks at the edge of his hair. Yeah, easy as that. Now with just a little Iron Hand steel, we're going to fill in the metallic stuff at the back of his head. Then a little bit of our black grey or Eshin grey from earlier, just to fill in the neck piece. And then a little bit of Nuln Oil just to finish off those two areas. And once that's dry, we're ready to varnish. Now, I'm going to recommend a very matte varnish. You could use Vallejo or the Army Painter. Storm Shield has that slight gloss to it, a satin finish, which I don't much like on my faces. I'm going to use Instars Varnish Plus. This one is brilliant. I know they are working on shipping to the EU, but if you're in the UK, you are off to a winner here, okay? Very, very much worth the price of admission. So I'm just going to apply a quick layer of this all over the head. And you'll see that's got a beautiful matte finish. No shine, and it's a really great varnish. But now it comes to pull this fella off his little macabre spike. I'm wearing a glove for this. You don't need to, but because I can never tell what I've stuck my hand in while I'm painting, at this point, if I were to make a big smudge on him, I would probably scream. So I'm going to stick to using a glove for this. Let's just work him off there. Into this neck joint, I'm going to put just a tiny spot of super glue. And I am actually going to glue his head in off camera because I want to be able to do this without messing it up at this stage. And there he is! Yeah! I'm so pleased I managed to get his head in the right position, eh? If you do want to do that without the stress of getting it in the right position first time, you can also use a tiny dot of PVA glue, which will take a little longer to set, but will give you much more time to work with the head if you want to make sure it's in the right spot. I promised you every stage, so here we go. I'm applying a little bit of Armageddon dust to the base. We're going to just quickly mash this on and finish him off. Now once that gunk has dried thoroughly, we can apply a layer of Seraphim Sepia over the top. Now you really don't need to drench it, just enough to tint that colour in the recesses a little. Now a quick dry brush of Tyrant Skull will finish this off. Then I'm going to go ahead, add a couple of tufts, and I will paint the rim of the base. Goodness me, I'm getting near the end now, can you tell? I'll paint that in XV88, because that's quite a nice deserty yellow kind of colour. After that, he'll be finished. So let's get a look at what he looks like at last when he is complete. So there at last, from start to finish, every step along the way, our Ultramarine Sergeant is complete. And I gotta say, if you put down an army that looks like that and somebody tries giving you guff that Ultramarines aren't cool, you push their nose in for them. I really like how this turned out. And despite the fact that there's no really advanced techniques, we're not blending, we're not doing anything like that, I still reckon he looks pretty cool. In particular, if you do struggle with painting a straight line, well, there's lots of ways you can fix that. And hopefully something here was interesting and might prove helpful no matter what sort of chapter you're painting. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my fantastic producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Jimmy, Trainboy, and Fred. Your support is invaluable. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.